The Athletic.
After their triumph in Miami, we talk McLaren's upgrade breakthrough. Plus, we discuss Adrian Newey's true value to an F1 team and answer your questions on simulators, boundary layer control and power steering. Welcome to another edition of the Race F1 Tech Show, where, as the name suggests, we talk all things technical in F1, so it didn't take us that long to come up with the name. I'm Edd Straw, but joining me is the main man who you've all downloaded this podcast to hear from, Gary Anderson. So hi Gary, pleased to have seen your old team McLaren get back to winning ways?
Yeah, it was good. I mean, it's one race in quite a few, so we have to wait and see how the trend flows. But, you know, it's the start. Lando Norris has had that hurdle on his back for a long time, trying to get his first win. He's been close to it a few occasions, but it never really happened. And this weekend it worked out for him. So of all the bad luck he had in the past, he's had a little bit of good luck. But, they were competitive all weekend. It's difficult because obviously they had a huge update package, and to go to a sprint weekend with a huge update package is fairly brave. But they made the best out of it. Is what you could say, I suppose, McLaren have been doing for quite a few years, to make the best out of what they've got. And making the best out of it this weekend was enough to win the race. So you got to pat them on the back for that. Absolutely.
Well, if you're there as best of the rest often enough, it can just take a little bit of fortune to swing it your way, and it was quite impressive. They had the pace for Norris to stay ahead, albeit with Verstappen probably losing a little bit of time to the damage from that bollard. Now, as always, we'll start off with a free choice of topics. I'll ask you what's caught your eye this week, but I suspect you've already alluded to it.
Yeah, I have. I mean, it is obviously the McLaren upgrade, and the thing that you just said there about, a little bit of luck because Verstappen's car probably had a fraction of damage on it. But to me, actually, there was 2 points in the race. Obviously, it was the end of the race where Norris was dominant and pulled away probably because Max was losing a tenth or 2 tenths. But the beginning of the race was even more important, where Piastri got himself into second. And, at that point in time, Max was okay. And he wasn't getting away from Piastri. It dwindled around, it increased, but it increased very, very slowly, up to something like 3.5 seconds or something. But it was that part of the race showed that I think, the McLaren was strong in Miami. But yeah, their upgrade, fairly comprehensive. You don't do too many of these in the season, I think, with the budget cap. So you've got to make sure that you pack it all together, and everything that is affected, you basically try to optimize it. So, I always say that the flow starts at the front wing. You might be trying to alter the flow further down the car a bit, but the flow does start at the front wing. So optimizing the flow coming off the trailing edge of that is quite important. You want to get the maximum from it as far as front wing load is concerned, but you want to get the minimum flow change on it, you want to get the optimum flow change on it so that the rest of the car has a good flow to work with. And that's where you sort of start the front wing. And you're trying to do two things, as I say, get it to work as hard as possible, but also get it to work as consistently as possible. And I think that's one of the areas we do see that I'm a big fan of the less complicated trailing edge profiles, I think I might call it, on front wings. And we can see from the leading cars, Ferrari, Red Bull, McLaren and Aston Martin as such, that their trailing edge is not very complicated. When you have a very wavy trailing edge, it leads to transverse flow, and if you've got transverse flow there, that's what the car sees. It doesn't know where it's coming from because it will alter as the speed increases and the downforce increases of the front wing. But once you get that front wing sorted, then the next thing is the front suspension. They say they have a new front suspension geometry. Whenever you call it geometry, you sort of talk about it being how the wheel goes up and down or how the wheel reacts to steering input. I think what they've really got is a front suspension profile change, because you use the front wishbone legs to catch that flow coming off the front wing and try to tame it a little bit, you might call it, realign it slightly for the things that are coming next. And it's the same with the front brake duct and that front wheel fairing. All of that is about managing the flow between the front wheel and the chassis and trying to get it to be as uniform as possible and heading to where you want it to head to next, which is the undercut and the side pod. And again, that would have been their objective: increase the undercut on the side pod, get the bottom of the radiator duct higher, which is what they've done. Obviously, it's a trend that Red Bull have started last year. So they got it a bit higher. They got more mass flow going through that undercut, which has allowed them to work the floor a little bit harder down the sides, and in turn then it helps work the underfloor a bit harder. It's one of these sort of things. You need to have more mass flow to achieve something, but you also need to have more of that mass flow so it doesn't end up with separation problems. So they've gone about it in the right way all the way through the car. They've just altered the flow that little bit, getting it to be more mass flow in the areas where they want it to be, and creating also some other low pressure areas, increasing that low pressure a little bit where they can put the radiator exits. So they've sort of done well right through the car as far as getting the pressure drop across the radiators and let the outlet a little bit better, minimising the flow going into the radiator and still getting the cooling adequate, and optimising the downforce from the car. Now again, Miami is a circuit, and the way it turned out this year, it was very slippery. So running downforce is good for there. There's definitely what you need for the tyres. And we know McLaren have, theoretically, they've always run, a fairly high downforce level relative to the other cars and been a little bit slower in the straight. So I think we need to wait for another couple of races to see how it all unfolds, because A, they wouldn't have got the optimum out of it for sure in Miami because of the sprint race characteristic, and B, it might just have suited Miami that little bit better than some other tracks. But in Miami, both Piastri and Norris were competitive at the beginning of the race and at the end of the race, and they went away with a win. So what else can you ask for, really? It just shows that it's possible. They run the same powertrain as Mercedes, who are not having a great time of it. They're not finding their way at all. They're doing developments for sure, but they're not finding their way through them. Whereas McLaren, they've had a plan since the beginning of last season, to be honest. They've stuck to that plan. They've introduced the updates and they've worked. So, yes, they definitely look as though they've joined Ferrari in that fight to beat Red Bull on any given event. But we'll have to wait and see if it really does unfold that way soon.
Yeah, that's what's remarkable about the progress McLaren has made. You alluded to where they were at the start of last season. Obviously, they said, we worked out something over the winter and it's going to take a few races before we start feeding that in. They laid the groundwork with an Azerbaijan upgrade, then the Austria upgrade leapt them forward. They had another big Singapore upgrade. And they're going in a similar direction to Red Bull all the time, but doing it well. They put things on the car and it works. So that, to me, shows that they have a very clear understanding of what they're trying to achieve and how to achieve it, whereas the comparison with Mercedes, they're still seem to be seemingly grasping in the dark, aren't they, in terms of trying to get things that work. But it's really, really impressive when a team can make those sure-footed steps, be confident in taking an upgrade to a sprint weekend, and obviously practice was slightly disrupted by that red flag as well. So for that to just be so dependable, for them to put a package on the car and for it to pretty consistently work, do what they want, and not be talking about this, we need to understand what's gone wrong here, it's really, really positive and speaks very well for the technical department, probably Andrea Stella's leadership as well. So it really does give you confidence that this is a team that can actually, in the longer term, be in a position to regularly challenge for wins on merit.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's, the calmness within the company and the direction. Nothing happens by clicking your fingers in Formula One. Well, anything, to be honest. You have to plan it. You have to understand it to plan it. And I think that, Mercedes are still looking for that magic bullet. They still believe that their package is better than anybody else. They just haven't got the setup right. And they've believed in that for 3 years now, to be honest, or 2.5 years, whatever it is. But it's not there like that. It's about identifying what you've got, where your problem is, and then trying to just make it better and staying within the same characteristics of the car. We saw, I think, Piastri, they say, had like 50% of the update on the car, or maybe more, and Norris had 100% of the update on the car because it wasn't supposed to be introduced to Imola, but they rushed it through a bit quicker. And you only do that if you've got confidence in what you've got. So their simulation and their understanding of what the car characteristics should be is, as you say, probably as good as or second to Red Bull at least. So they're in a good position to go forward if they've got that good understanding, because all they're doing is developing a good car into a better car. They're not trying to develop something that has got really nasty characteristics into a good car. And that's really where Mercedes are. They go from one day to another, from one type of characteristic to another one. So they've got no consistency within themselves to actually recognise where the problem really lies. And that's the first thing you've got to do, is leave it alone and just get on with it. Get the best out of what you've got, try to recognise the problem, and then fix it. Because every time you put a way out wacky setup on the car or do something oddball to try and find that magic bullet, you just confuse yourself because you create some other problem. They're self-created problems. They're not actually what the car wants. There's a basic setup, I think, that these cars, sort of respond to. And then you go with a little bit more front or a little bit less rear, or vice versa, or a little bit stiffer front or a little bit stiffer rear, depending upon what the circuit wants as far as understeer, oversteer characteristics are concerned, or tyre usage front or rear is concerned. But that's it. So, that's what you need to do, is work within that little window and just try to get consistency from your problem. And then if you've got consistency from the problem, you can try and address it. But I don't see Mercedes doing that at all. I think there's, within the walls of Mercedes in Brackley here, there's a bit of pressure building up, I'd say, because McLaren are showing them that, it is possible to fight Red Bull and Ferrari on a good day and get a good result out of it, as opposed to always being that oddball result that just appears every now and again. So let's see what the next few races bring, because I think it needs to settle down a little bit.
At the end of last year, myself and Mark Hughes sat down with Andrea Stella and went over the progress they'd made. One of the really interesting things Stella talked about was how they'd slightly changed the way they process all their aerodynamic data, etc. Obviously, when you're doing wind tunnel testing or whatever, you're looking for certain characteristics, certain numbers, and for want of a better phrase, you kind of get a green light for, like, green light, is this working better? Red light, not working better. And he referenced the fact they'd changed the way they'd approach that. And actually, some of the changes that yielded the big gains under their old way of processing the data would actually been more of a no.
Yep.
And I think that gets to the bottom of where Mercedes seem to be struggling, because you've got this counterintuitive thing with these regulations that just looking for those peak downforce numbers is even less relevant than ever before, because it's easy to get a startling downforce number in one condition with the ground effect floors. I could probably even do it. But the trick is actually doing that so it's usable and you don't hit all the problems. And that seems to be what Mercedes is butting up against. So that, for me, seems to be the big difference between Mercedes and McLaren. Not the output, but it's almost the approach and the thinking, the what they're trying to do. And almost Mercedes haven't kind of got away from that idea of just like, there is downforce there and it can be made to happen, rather than needing to get that wider picture of how to make it consistent and usable, which we've talked about endlessly over the past few years on this podcast with Mercedes. But that just seems to be the absolute key for Mercedes that McLaren has.
Yeah, my first bit of advice there would be, Ed, to just stick to writing your excellent columns and forget about becoming an aerodynamist. really would be positive for us.
I don't think it would be wise. Yeah.
No. I mean, it is the characteristics of what you build a car around, and you need to believe in those things. And I remember going way back, we had a really troubled start to 1998 at Jordan, and the car just wasn't doing what it should have done from the wind tunnel, because all the stuff we'd done, it had more downforce, it had all the right stuff, it was lighter, it was stiffer, it was all the stuff that you should get to move forward that little bit from 97. And I remember scratching my head a bit and just thinking, what can this be? Because it's something that we don't research properly. And I drove down, we had the wind tunnel down in Brackley, and the main factory was at Silverstone, and I was driving down there just thinking, what can this be? So I thought, I'll have a think about steering angle and front downforce. So I went down there, and our chief aerodynamist was there with a group of guys and was having a meeting with them. And I said, what would you expect from steering lock? And to a man, they all said, don't know. And I thought, well, we should know, because it's a really important thing. So we devised a way to sort of have a Heath Robinson check at the steering angle, which, to be honest, we used to do years before that, but then sort of dropped it because management in the company changed a bit. and everybody was going for this ultimate downforce figure. The management loved to see a wind tunnel monthly report to say you'd found X downforce for, X drag, and oh yeah, we're going forward, which is all rubbish in my book. And it's one of those sort of things, whenever we checked out the best we could of what the steering angle was doing, in my opinion, it was doing the wrong thing. It was going, the centre of pressure was moving rearwards whenever you put more steering lot in the car. By definition, if you got, understeer, the driver will put more steering lot in the car, and if the centre of pressure is moving rearwards, the understeer will get greater. And that was, in my book, what was confusing the driver. It took us a while to, make new side pods, because it involved side pods, front wing end plates, front wing detail, to actually sort of improve it. But we did. So what I'm really saying here, it's the characteristics that you have, that you set out for what the car has to react to on the track. What happens when you put steering lock on it? What happens when you put roll on it? What happens when you put yaw on it? What happens for its ride height range? What happens whenever you put big braking loads into it? All those are questions that need answers. And somewhere along the line at the beginning of a car design, you need to define the direction you would take with that and what you would do. And if you haven't got those, then you're working blindly. You can find more downforce, but can you use it? Is it the right time, or is it? There's no point in having, a very draggy car at high speed, because at high speed, by definition, you want the downforce to diminish, or that you want the drag to diminish. So it's a circle of events, and if you don't spec the car to begin with correctly, and have all your team of people working to better that direction, to follow that direction, then at the end of the day you end up with just a mess. And I think that's where Mercedes have got to. They've got themselves into a circle of events that's just a bit of a mess, and they're not actually working for one clear direction. They're working in every direction possible. They're doing all the stuff, but they're actually not addressing the problem.
Yeah, and the clock is counting down on that, because obviously the sort of preliminary conceptual work on 2026 cars, even though the rules aren't completely finalised, they know pretty much which way they're going. That's starting to happen. And obviously, as of January the 1st, you've got full-on aero testing and development on that. So, yeah, they really need to get on top of that very soon, and they can perhaps take some inspiration from McLaren's way of doing things. Right, well, for our headline topic, we've absolutely got to talk about Adrian Newey, haven't we? Obviously, there's something of a frenzy as every team tries to secure his services. We don't yet know what he's going to do, although there's an expectation among many in F1 that he will join Ferrari. We just don't know as yet. Now, it's quite interesting because there's been this narrative downplaying how much Newey actually does. But also, we've always talked about the benefit of having someone who's not at the coalface 24/7, who's looking at the big conceptual picture, can inject that creativity. So how central do you think he has been to Red Bull's success? And do you think that any saying, oh, he's not actually that important, is just rationalising it? You're losing him, so of course you don't want to say, oh, well, that's a massive loss. You want to say, it's all right. He didn't really do much.
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, he's one of these guys, he's got lots and lots of experience, and it's been all good experience. It's not been bad experience. Now, he's generated a lot of that good experience himself. So he does understand what makes the car go well. Now, we just talked there about the sort of Mercedes or McLaren or Red Bull problems, and I keep saying it's the characteristics of the car going around the track. And I think Adrian brings that to the team. He brings with him the characteristics that the car needs to go around the track from his point of view. Now, other people will have maybe a different point of view, but if you can sit down and explain it to somebody, how your point of view makes the car a better car for the driver, then it's fine. You can do that. So, I think he's in a position now where he's not on the cliff face. He was on the cliff face way back whenever we were talking about having 10, 15, 20 people in the drone office. Now you've got 250 or 300 or maybe even more. So he's not on the cliff face as far as that's concerned, but that still doesn't stop him thinking and coming up with potential solutions for them to try as far as design's concerned when he wants to. But I think his main input to the team, which are obviously a very, very strong team of people at Red Bull, but his main input to the team would be the characteristics. Lay them down and then get your really good people to follow that path. and optimise the car around that path. So I think he does bring a lot to the team, although albeit that if the people that are there have learned anything, that's what they should have learned. Listen to Adrian and get on with it. And I think that's where people like Dan Fallows benefited, and obviously Aston Martin benefited. When Dan Fallows left and went to Aston Martin, he took with him some of that, I don't know what you like to call it, some of that, as I say, car characteristic, and exploited that to the maximum. But as time goes by, that changes. That constantly changes. Every time a driver reports something on the radio, that might change. So it's a living thing. And as I say, as time goes by, you might lose contact with what is the best solution, because it doesn't come because you've sort of learned it, I suppose. It comes from just gut feel and actually driving a bit yourself and listening to the driver and trying to put an engineering solution into a human complaint. So I think Adrian does bring a lot to a team. I think he can help a lot of teams with that, but they've got to understand they need to work with him and allow him to do it in his way.
One of the interesting things is there has been reference to a little bit of needle in there about who gets credit, etc. So is the one vague positive, and at least it means that any friction there is between what you might call the regular technical team, who do all of the heavy lifting, if you like, it means the 26 car is going to be the work of Pierre Vacher, their technical director, Enrico Balbo, the head of Aero, really good people there. So you could see why Newey moving on will have them rubbing their hands thinking, right, this is our chance to show just how vital we are. So that, I guess, is a positive, although there is also the danger of they might underestimate just what having someone of Newey's ilk who's just that step back and able to look at it from a step away, how much that really brings. And obviously you're a great exponent, actually, of the benefit of being that step detached and not being mired in everything, to gain a little bit of clarity. So how do you see all that balancing out?
I think the power struggle that we see, or the credibility struggle that we see, is not necessarily within the technical department. I would be very surprised if the technical people don't see Adrian as a good sounding block, because I don't think he's one of these guys that sort of flexes his muscles and says, no, we must do it this way. I mean, I go back a few years and to say that some of the cars he created in the early Red Bull days were and from McLaren were nigh on impossible to design, because he just was so, everything was so compact. He was pushing everything to the limit. But through time, people have learned to live with that and do that and make sure that they achieve that, because they saw it actually functioned. Once you get past the fact that the company isn't capable of achieving what he wanted years ago, you modify the company to make sure that it's capable of achieving that. And that's really what Red Bull have done. So I think the people in the technical department would, to a man, probably look at him and say, yep, good bloke. He's there. He's a sounding block now more than a doer. But that sounding block is still a very solid sounding block. And if he said we should turn left, there's a good chance we should look at maybe turning left. At least don't turn right, maybe go straight ahead. But, think about turning left, because it's probably not the wrong way to go. And for many years, the start of the season, he's always had cars that had something new on them. Whenever we talked about the Kwanda effect and, the blowing of the brake ducts. And at the beginning of the season, it didn't work, but he believed he could make it work. And unless you start with a concept that allows you to optimize it as time goes by, then you're behind before you even start. So he's always been a big believer in what could be taken from something, as opposed to you've got to prove it in numbers immediately for it to be of any value. And I think that rubs off as well. So I think the power struggle really, which is what we're talking about in Red Bull, is more up the top end, the management power struggle. And we knew that was one of the reasons that Adrian left McLaren, because it was a battle of wills between him and Ron Dennis as to, who was really responsible for the success. Ron wanted the success to be Ron Dennis's success, and rightly so. He owned the company, pulled it up from nothing. But the success is the technical success, and I wish that well, we will at some point in time hear the truth, but I'm sure that the Adrian and Christian Horner aren't quite the bedfellows that we all think they are from the outside world, and there's a bit of a power struggle there. So I think it comes from that. Anyway, we'll see. Time will tell. I would like to see him at Ferrari. I think it'd be great to see if Ferrari could be turned around and become a real competitive group of people. They've got some of it there, but they haven't got all of it yet. And probably what they're missing is somebody to just point them in a direction. And I think with Fred Vasseur heading up the company, they would accept, listen, and be happy to take Adrian in there.
Well, that's a good point about accepting and listening, because obviously, let's say he goes to another F1 team, and it's not a foregone conclusion he will. He says he hasn't decided, and he could just go off into retirement or go sailing for years or whatever. But I suspect he'll want at some point to take on the challenge of an F1 team. But if you're the technical director of an F1 team, and your team boss comes up to you and say, right, we've got Adrian Newey, he's going to have this sort of floating top-level role. How do you think that plays? Is that the kind of thing that you think everyone will embrace? Because some might have a little bit of an ego trouble with it. I think there is a risk, isn't there, that if you parachute someone into a team, let's say you give them this, what will seem like a part-time job almost to the rank and file, is there a risk of that destabilising a team?
Yes, there's always that risk, and that's why I mentioned Fred Vasseur at the end of that there, because I believe that he is capable from the outside of steering it a little bit and making sure that it doesn't have an internal implosion within the team, because you bring in somebody that will be, without doubt, a top level. I think the way that the rules are these years now with the cost cap, that you can do things at the top end of the company that still keeps people outside of it and get paid lots of money, and they get paid lots of money, but. And there's so many handles to the jug now. There used to be a technical director, a chief designer, head of aerodynamics, and so on and so forth. Now we've got the chief technical officer and the second chief technical officer and the stand-in chief technical, and so on. So there's lots of handles to the jug. And it depends on what that job description is, and that definition, and how it relates to other projects, which obviously is another area where the cost cap doesn't come into it. Companies starting other projects to justify the existence of another couple of hundred people. So there's lots of ways of playing with that. But I think at the end of the day, the main thing has to come from the top. It can't be just slip somebody in there and put them level with somebody else and hope they all work together, because that takes time. So I think if he does go to Ferrari, as I say, Fred Vasseur, I think, is strong enough to separate politics from the reality of success. And I think at the top end of Ferrari, they'll realise that they need a little bit of guidance from somebody. Not somebody that's going to work their way up through the ranks and become the great god, but somebody that's just going to come in and give them a little bit of advice in a few directions that they probably are missing. So I think it can be done. It would be, obviously, you'd sit down with your people, you'd talk to them sensibly about it, and you'd hope that you would come up with a solution that would mean everybody could work together quite happily, and Adrian could have his plate of pasta.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's realising that as good as Newey is, he's not a magic bullet. You don't just sort of lob him in without any thought and just assume everything will work out very well. But I'm interested with the idea of Ferrari, because I have been quite sceptical about whether he'd want to go, because I think if he worked for Ferrari, he would want to actually be based there for at least a decent amount of time. I don't think he'll do the John Barnard style, set up a Guildford technical base and try and do it completely remotely, even though he wouldn't need to be there all the time. But you wrote a piece that ran on the race website which argued that the thing that perhaps would get Newey over the line at Ferrari would be the chance to do a Ferrari road car, almost the ultimate road-going supercar, which I imagine also would have great appeal for Ferrari in terms of a sales pitch, as it were, to customers. So do you think that could be the thing, that he almost goes there primarily to do that, and he can also spend an amount of his time to breathe on the F1 programme? So it kind of ticks both boxes. He gets something that he can do that's unique, because who gets to design Ferraris ultimately and use all those resources and call and all that history and prestige as well? It's just the perfect thing, while also actually helping them with the big picture stuff on F1.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is that there's a huge amount of supercar manufacturers out there of some sort or another doing stuff, but they'll never carry the credibility of Ferrari. No matter how long they go for, they'll never ever be a Ferrari. You know, you see them all on the road, and you look at them and think, oh, that looks nice, but you know, Ferrari, you look at it and think, it's Ferrari. So I think for Adrian, as a creative designer, you know, to have a Newey Ferrari would be something that, well, nobody else could ever offer. You know, it doesn't matter how many Aston Martins you built or how many McLaren road cars or, you know, whatever. It's never going to be a Ferrari. So that magnet to me, I mean, he's getting on, but he's not old. He's 65. So there's, you know, because of what he does, it's not as though he's going down a coal mine every day of the week, you know, working flat out and that sort of thing. It's about being creative, and I think the Formula One team needs a little bit of guidance now and for the future. But the road car thing would be where I see him having the magnet to sort of end his career, I suppose you might call it, building the ultimate Ferrari designed by Adrian Newey would be something that there are a lot of supercar owners out there in the world would probably sell all their supercars to buy one of them. So the price would be immaterial. It would just be such a mega vehicle. So yeah, I just see that as an opening for him, a fantastic opening. He's interested in it, and he can still bring someone to the F1 team on the way to that ultimate goal.
Well, that's the great thing that he hasn't done. He has been involved with some fantastic road car projects, but he hasn't done what, say, Gordon Murray did when he did the McLaren F1. Now, that's a hugely influential car. That's a defining supercar, isn't it? The McLaren F1 that Gordon Murray did. Newey hasn't done that defining signature supercar. And the idea of a Newey Ferrari, it could be a kind of 21st century McLaren F1 almost, couldn't it? Something that redefines what you can have from a road car. And that's got to appeal to him, hasn't it?
Yes, it must appeal to him. As you say, with Gordon's original McLaren F1, it still stands out as being just the best McLaren ever built, really. In reality, it's, you know, they're selling at some huge prices nowadays. And Gordon's obviously got his new project just about on the market now. And we'll see how that goes. But it's not coming, you know, it's not coming with a name weight behind it, I suppose you might call it. And the reality of all is, you know, Ferrari have that name weight. They are the company, i.e. Bugatti, Lamborghini. They've all got their name, but Ferrari are still that one that sort of like you look at and think it's a Ferrari. And yes, I'd love to see it. A Newey Ferrari would definitely be at the same level as a Murray McLaren, but it would be, because of Ferrari's name, I think it would be to a different level completely. It would be just extraordinary. And I think we knew his expertise and what he'd put into it and how he would know that this would be the ultimate road car for the next decade at least. I think what he'd put into it would be exceptional. So it'd be interesting to see.
Well, there's going to be plenty of talk and speculation about where Newey goes and the impact in the coming weeks. It was obviously a huge talking point in the paddock at the Miami Grand Prix. It even had James Vowles at Williams talking about making a play, which has got obviously a certain amount of appeal. But yeah, this is going to be as big as the Lewis Hamilton driver move if and when he decides to join another Formula One team. So I'm sure we'll talk about that again when we know where his future lies. Well, as always, we love a question on the Race F1 Tech Show, and we've got 3 excellent ones to answer in a moment. If you've got a question you'd like answered about F1 Tech, whether it's one that seems simple or perhaps even one that might risk being bafflingly complex or anything in between, please do send it in and we'll try to answer it on a future episode. You can send your questions to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com. And you can submit them either in written form or by recording a voice note and sending it to us and remembering to include who you are in the message. The first question comes from Paul Hodgen, who says, I'm new to the Race Members Club and I have a question for Gary Anderson. Why are the teams allowed so much simulator time? Surely to make it more competitive, it would be best if all the teams were not allowed one. You could make the practice sessions an hour and a half long to make sure that all safety matters were taken care of. But with the teams only having data from practice, would this make it more competitive?
It's one of those things, there's lots and lots of ways of changing it around. The simulator... what is a simulator? if you do a good Excel sheet, you can come up with a simulation of a lap time relative to the drag down and downforce you're going to have. It's just the simulators they have nowadays get more and more complicated, and it's all about the inputs, what you can feed into it, tyre characteristics, aerodynamic characteristics, all of that stuff. And it obviously ends up that it adds to track time. As we know, teams talk about correlation, and the simulator to the track is never always quite that correlation. And that's usually the data you put in from the wind tunnel, or your tyre data, or your kinematics data, whatever. And you've got to remember as well that the driver is a human being, and he has to have the feel in the seat of his pants, that he's feeling the car load up correctly, and that the load's consistent, and it's not peaky. Whereas the simulator doesn't really have to have that feeling. The simulator doesn't give the driver that loading up feeling in the car. So the simulator is a tool on the way there, but it's not as good as practice. And I don't disagree with you that practice time has been taken away, and then people have exploited the simulators further, and we as the general public don't see that. We just see the cars on the racetrack. I think one of the things from my point of view to make it more human input would be to do away with the data. Allow the cars to gather the data, but you don't get it until Sunday night. And the only data you do get is safety data, for example. We hear them talking about, your front tyre pressures are getting too high, or your tyre temperatures are getting out of control, or the brakes aren't working. Or there was a time when that all happened, but the driver had to sort of feel it for himself and try and work out what was going on. And that would be lovely to get that back again. Just do a race meeting, limit the data to half a dozen channels of safety stuff, and let the engineers and the drivers work together to try and get the best out of the car and see what happens. Because at the end of the day, that's what we want to see. You could have robots driving the cars, but it's not what we want to see. We want the human element to be there. We want the human element, or I want the human element from the pit wall as well, to advise people to do things. But you're advising them to do something blindly, I suppose is the best way of putting it. I think there's too much involvement from being able to simulate what's going on in the background from the data you're gathering all the time. So instead of having an hour's practice session, you've got 24-hour practice session because of the simulation you can do. But even then, the simulation is not 100%. It's a direction finder. So I don't disagree with you, but I would look at it the other way and say, bring it all into being a human element, reduce the data that you can gather and react to immediately. Still gather all the data so that Sunday night you can sit down there and look at it and see where you went wrong, or how your development of the car should go, but don't do it until the Sunday night, until after the race, so that you've got to work blindly on the way to that race result.
The next question comes from Peter Ellinger, who says, have any F1 cars employed boundary layer control, as used on the wings of the Blackburn Buccaneer carrier strike aircraft of the Royal Navy, to improve aerodynamic efficiency? That's a good question. I guess it's worth defining boundary layer control as a starting point in answering that one. Yeah, it is worth. I mean, it is one of these things. It has been used, and to be honest, it to an extent still is used. Boundary layer is a strange thing because you're just trying to re-energize the surface flow, and trying to make sure that you're getting from a certain component what you should do. Now, if you do look at the Buccaneer, I mean, it had all airplanes have two very different characteristics. When they're going down the runway, or wherever they take off from, they've got maximum weight and minimum speed. So they've got to get to a speed, and then they've got to have a wing characteristic that will lift that weight. I think the gross weight of the Buccaneer was 28 ton, something like that. So it was, it's a heavy old airplane, but you have to create 28 tons worth of lift, that low speed. But then you also have to have it to be efficient whenever you get to high speed. So it has to have two characteristics: a huge amount of lift from the wings at low speed, and obviously if you are cambering the wing as such to get that lift out of it, there's a very good chance of airflow separation. So having boundary layer control, or as it was more like in the Buccaneer, was a blown wing, which we obviously had through the F duct and through the
exhaust-blown wings and exhaust-blown downforce-producing devices. All you're doing is increasing the speed of the flow on that wing. You're trying to make that wing think that the car or airplane in this case is going faster than it actually is to increase the lift on it. So the Buccaneer was fed with jets from the high pressure jets from the engine air to make that wing think that the airplane was going faster, so it could get the lift that it needed off the wing a lot earlier. A racing car is the same. You want downforce at low speed, and then you want more efficient at a high speed, so you want less drag at a high speed. So it's a very similar characteristic. But it's not just the wing. I mean, if you do take the Buccaneer, the amount of downforce it produced to get that lift is actually less than what a Formula One car would generally produce at the same speed. So it's a whole different characteristic. But boundary layer control, I'm sure it's still there in areas of a Formula One car, or at least people look at it and try to, how would you say, flow air in the right place to help without boundary layer control. It's about high-speed air. That's what setting up vortices do. The airflow in a vortice is much faster than the airflow outside of a vortice. So you're still trying to do it, but it's regulated against, I suppose you might call it, since we lost the F duct and the various exhaust-blown stuff. But anyway, yes, it has been used. It still is used to a certain extent, and it'll never go away once you sort of generate an idea. It always hangs in there somewhere waiting on an opportunity to exploit it.
And the third question today comes from Ben, who says, my question is regarding power steering. Do you think F1 would benefit the viewer if the current cars or even the next-gen cars had no power steering? When you watch other open-wheel categories, such as IndyCar, where the drivers don't have power steering, you can really see them working away at the wheel and visually see many of the corrections and effort that goes into every lap. Sometimes, when we are witnessing greatness on a qualifying lap, the steering input and motions from the driver look almost effortless. It would be fantastic to get that raw feeling back from the onboard cameras. We've all seen the Santa Monaco lap, but maybe modern onboard cameras are almost too good at filtering out the violence of a modern F1 car. Also, the drivers would probably have to bulk up a bit, which means even less paint on the car.
Yeah, well, I think, yes, the drivers would have to bulk up a bit, but if we do look at the steering feedback, the first thing you would do if you didn't have power steering on the car was you would have to reduce the load that's generated by the suspension and steering geometry. So basically, you get back to the fact that you would lose potential performance a little bit because of that. But that's also the reason why you see the feedback on cars that don't have power steering, is because the loads that needs to be generated to get whip feedback into the steering wheel would also be less. So that's why you see a lot more steering reaction to cars that don't have power steering, because it, as such, I suppose you might call it, it doesn't have a damper in the middle of it. Now that damper can be quite a strange thing, because it can also influence the driver's feel of the car and delay it. If the damper is sort of too strong, it can delay the feeling of the car. So although the car is given the same sort of feedback, it doesn't happen quite as quickly. But it's also not given the feedback because the loads, the input from the steering, the loads have to be a lot higher. Whenever you're talking about shock loads and seeing steering wheel feedback, the loads have to be a lot higher if you've got a power steering because of the geometry of the suspension. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg. The drivers come to terms with the fact of a change of load, I suppose you might call it. Whether you're putting in, 10 kilograms per metre of torque into the steering wheel because you haven't got any power steering, or whether you're putting in 3 kilograms of torque into the steering column because you have got power steering, you still feel the difference on that 3 kilograms as you would feel the difference on the 10. However, the input from hitting a curb or any bumps now on the track are much more when you've got the no power steering, because it can obviously affect it much more because it's 12 kilograms will take the steering wheel out of your hands as such. So it's not only good for the car or good for the situation as far as the driver effort's concerned, but we also look at Indy cars and take them as an example quite a bit, and we do have to recognise that Indy cars do not drive on snooker tables or billiard tables. They do drive on fairly bumpy circuits, so the inputs from all those bumps and curbs and the tracks that they race on is incredibly different. If you took a Formula One car in, I don't know, Alton Park or wherever, one of the other tracks, Snetterton, I don't know which tracks are bumpy these days, I haven't been to many of them lately. I think you would see difference in the input and the reaction of the car because of the bumps and the characteristics of it. So, it's not all, you can't always compare apples with apples. Sometimes they are a bit different. Power steering, is it here to stay? Yes, it is here to stay. At a certain level you're allowed. So I think you have to leave it alone and say that it doesn't really do any harm, but does it actually do any good? Probably not. And we don't want to see the cars lose the paint jobs, do we? We all complained about the cars turning to black instead of being nicely coloured. So we don't want the driver to muscle up anymore and lose paintwork.
It's always an interesting question when you have something like this in terms of the implications of removing something. I mean, one interesting thing that leaps to mind is if you just said tomorrow power steering's banned, could you put a non-power steering system on that car and would the driver still be able to handle it? Because obviously the way you do the geometry is influenced by the opportunities created in power steering. So it's interesting to kind of step through that process, isn't it, in terms of how much might it actually redefine what you do with suspension geometry, if at all, or would it just be an invisible difference?
No, it would be a difference. I mean, if you were to take the power steering off one of these cars just by taking the steering rack off and putting a normal steering rack onto it, a mechanical one, then I don't think you'd even get out of the pit lane. So, the steering would be so heavy. So yes, the characteristics of the cars at the moment have all gone around geometries that allow the car to have some weight transfer when you turn the steering wheel. And that, because you're doing that weight transfer when you turn the steering wheel, it's a sort of a load in the steering wheel. And because you got the power steering, you can cope with that. But if you hadn't got the power steering, you couldn't. So you'd have to sort of redo the geometry to ease that load. I think if you took a Formula One car, as I say, and optimise the suspension geometry to allow it to be driven without power steering, which is what you would really have to do, you would lose, well, theoretically you should lose a bit of lap time. I wouldn't be surprised if there was very little difference in it. But theoretically, with all the developments going into that area to optimise it and get the best lap time out of it, it would be a bit disappointing if you didn't lose some lap time. But as I say, it's a bit of a chicken and egg. You'd have to really try hard. It wouldn't take long to get back to equilibrium, I suppose you might call it, but you couldn't just switch it off overnight and hope that tomorrow morning it'll be okay. We haven't seen a driver that's lost the power steering lately, as far as trying to drive with it, because it is, although it's a very complicated thing, it's a very basic thing. So there's no real reliability issues with it. So I think it's here to stay. I don't see why you should get rid of it. It's one of these things where the regulations say the driver must drive the car alone and unaided. Well, paddle gear shifts, electronic clutches, power steering, you name it. They're all driver aids. They're all there to help the driver. The driver still has to have the input, but I'm afraid they're all there to help the driver.
There's also an interesting point made in the question about the onboard cameras almost being too good, and that's one of the other interesting questions, because I think almost the savageness of older onboards is exaggerated by the quality of the cameras. It's a bit of a shame anyway, because there's quite a nostalgic feel for those onboards, isn't there? But it's something you can't really get back because the technology has moved on. But that's another interesting question, isn't it? You alluded to it with bumps in the track in IndyCar and that kind of thing. I imagine that if you were to have a non-power assisted steering in F1, I'm not sure it would look monstrously different, funnily enough, because they're so fine-tuned to driving right on the fine limit of those tyres, and a lot of the move, because the cars move a huge amount. It's really hard to see on the TV camera. Obviously, as you'll know, if you watch trackside, you can see a lot more of that little fine detail. So it's almost like the range of the car's movements are difficult to detect with whatever medium you use, rather than just it being down to one thing, like, for example, power steering.
Yeah, I mean the cameras have been developed for years now to sort of cope with the harsh environment. It is a really, really harsh environment in the car. I mean, you're seeing huge inputs, but it is, as you say, it's not just the power steering, and the car is always on the move. The car, that's why I keep saying about the car and its performance. It's about the transient effect, because the fact the car is always on the move, the driver is waiting. The driver's always waiting for that movement to stop. You know, as he turns into the corner, the rear will always be tending to give him a feeling of oversteer, because that's, you know, you want the car to rotate, and the only way you can get the car to rotate is by having good initial front grip, and the rear just building up its slip angle by moving. And that slip angle is only 3 or 4 degrees, but to a driver, that 3 or 4 degrees is like, I'm in the hedge, you know, this is going around, and then it stops. And that's where again, going back to the simulator question, that's where the simulator doesn't do that. It doesn't give you that feeling of it's slipping, stopped, good. And it's a characteristic of the tyre, how the tyre slip angle builds up and, you know, arrests the movement of the car. It's a balance of the car, how much front end you've got for that initial turn. It's a whole combination of stuff. And as you say, if power steering was done away with, you would still drive within that same window. It wouldn't be that you would do strange things. You know, you wouldn't just chuck the car into a corner sideways and hope you'd catch it again. You know, I remember Nelson Piquet, one of his characteristics of driving the car was that the steering wheel used to always be on the move. He was always feeling where he was with the front tyre slip angle. Just turn it a little bit more and the car would just understeer a little bit, turn it back, and you're right on that edge of the maximum slip angle of the tyre. Even Fernando Alonso in his Michelin days would drive the car in a similar way. He would go into the corner early in a stint and put, you know, far too much steering lock on far too quickly and break the car into an understeer just to sort of protect the rear tyres, because he knew later on in the stint he was going to need that change of that balance. And one of the tools he had was the rate of steering input. And all that characteristic is about just feeling the tyre load up and knowing you're at the peak. And obviously, you know, power steering is part of that. But if it went away, I think it would just still be part of it. And you just, you know, you'd evolve in a season probably back to where you are now without just having lost the power steering and just having to put a little bit more muscle into it, perhaps.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting there's a bit of an advantage as well in IndyCar when it's a spec series. You can engineer in a little bit of that spectacle into the spec of things like the steering, etc. But obviously F1 cars are prototypes, so they have inevitably there's the push to iron things out and smooth things out, etc. Well, thanks very much for those excellent questions and the great answers as well. Remember, if you'd like to submit a question, you can send it to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com. Thanks to everyone who did submit a question. Thanks also to Gary for your great insights. We'll be back after the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix at Imola, so stay with us for more from Gary.
The Athletic.